Welcome to Keepers of Liberty. I'm your host, Professor Will Wagner. Today we're going to talk about how one's worldview affects the destiny of a nation. In Genesis 1:1, we learn, in the beginning, God. When you look out into the sky at night and you see these beautiful stars, or you are in the state of Michigan, for example, we have these beautiful rivers and you can catch these beautiful fish called rainbow trout, and they're just gorgeous. And you can see the beauty and the power of God's creation and everything He created. And each time He created something like the beasts or the fish in the sea, He said, it was good. And then He created man and woman, and He said it was very good. Now, when God is out there doing good and very good, it doesn't take the devil very long before the devil notices and starts messing with it a little bit. And so God had given a lens to Adam and Eve through which to see the world, a perspective that God gave them for their own good, for their own safety. And he told them, don't eat from the tree from the good of evil, and you shall surely die. Well, what the devil does, he says you don't need God's perspective. And so let's jump to chapter 3, verse 1. And we see the devil comes in and he says, you don't need God's perspective on the world. You can be just like God. And it can be all about you and your personal autonomy and your identity. You don't need God's perspective in the world. And so from the very beginning of creation, we've had a battle of worldviews, a battle of perspectives through which to see the world. Now let's jump forward from Genesis 3:1 a few years to 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Well, why do you think that the framers of our great nation found that the truths were self-evident? Well, through a perspective that God has given us, that perspective we saw in Genesis 1:1, we know that God has put the law on our hearts. We know that there is a right and a wrong and a good and a bad. God gives us the standard. He gives us the perspective through which to see the world. And all along the way, you can be sure that the devil's going to be challenging everything that you do if you are using God's perspective with which to see the world, whether it's talking about how you conduct your life, how you, on a personal level, are raising your family, or how you are governing a nation. Is it about the perspective that God has given us, that truth really does exist, that there's good and bad, right and wrong, just or unjust, or can you make it up as you want to go? And you can be just like God and say, hey, I can tell you what is good, and I don't have to have God tell me what is good. And your good's good for you, and my good's good for me. And truth doesn't matter because it's all relative. Your truth can be good for you, and your truth can be good for me. And even though we know that, the rule of non-contradiction shows that that just can't be correct, because if you have two things and they are diametrically opposed to each other, they both can't be true. And so we have this battle of perspectives going on since the very beginning of creation. And you can believe that that battle was going on when the founders of our nation were creating this great country. Let me read you the definition of politics that the framers of our Constitution, that the founders of our nation would have read in Webster's dictionary back then. The science of government, that part of ethics which consists in the regulation and government of a nation or state, the preservation of its safety, peace, and prosperity, comprehending the defense of its existence and the rights against foreign control or conquest, and the protection of its citizens in their rights with the preservation and improvement of their morals. That's a very different definition of politics than we use in today's contemporary world of public policy making, isn't it? It's a very different definition of politics that we think about when we think of our constitutional governance under the rule of law. That's because that battle of perspectives that began in the garden, continued through the beginning of our nation, continues until today. When our founders came to this nation, they came from a place where the king had deemed himself the law. Lex rex or rex lex, that is some Latin for saying either the king is law or no one, not even the king, is above the law. Either everyone, including the king, is under the law, or the king is law and therefore can do no wrong. Can the government say, hey, it's all about, I know what's right and wrong. I don't have to be held to any higher standard, and I'm just going to, therefore, deem what is right and wrong. No, God says something very different, does he? What does God say? God says the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases. That's Proverbs 21:1. Let's remember that as we go through this series, that God is in control, no matter how difficult the situation, no matter how controversial the problem seems to be in front of us. Know that our Lord is always in control. How did our founders see the role of government? Well, they certainly did not see it as a theocracy, but they did see it as informed by ancient sacred tenets. They said, it's okay to have a perspective. Not is it just okay, it's going to be beneficial if we start with and being informed by an ancient sacred standard that God has given us. And that ancient sacred standard suggested that everyone ought to submit themselves to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God, we learn in the book of Romans. For he's God's servant to do good, but if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an ancient of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Our founders saw as the foundation of government authority that every law, every government action had to be grounded in some ethical or moral foundation. And where do you get those ethical and moral standards from? Well, they're revealed in God's absolutes, and they're naturally put on our heart by God. There is this idea that on the other hand, someone's always going to be arguing, no, you don't have to follow any standard of right and wrong, and there is no such thing as right and wrong. You can make it up as you go. And so if you are a government authority or a judge or a legislator, you don't have to be held to any standard of right and wrong or good and bad, because you can look through your own lens. And you, because you're holding power, can deem what is right and what is wrong. Well, the problem with that, moral relativism, is that whoever has the biggest gun controls what is going to be right and wrong. Whoever's in power at the time is not held to any standard, and it completely ignores the truth that all have sinned and fallen short. And Lord Acton's corollary to that biblical truth that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, which is why our founders said that every law and every government action ought to be grounded in an ethical or a moral foundation, where that standard that God has put in his word, his moral absolutes, and he's put them naturally on our heart, those standards are the perspective through which we can see the world. I had the privilege of serving in all three branches of the United States government, and before I was able to and allowed to exercise power in any one of those branches, I had to put my hand on the Holy Bible. and my other hand toward heaven. And I had to swear and affirm that I would uphold the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So help me God. And the reason that those who are holding the judicial power, that those who in the Department of Justice are holding the power of the sword, the power to put somebody in prison for their life, to even take their life away. Before you are given the privilege of exercising that power, you have to remember from whence that power comes. And you have to remember that no one, not even the king, not even the judge, not even the prosecutor, not even the police officer is above the law. No one, not even the king, is above the law. And that is that perspective that our framers understood, that you have to, when you're exercising power, when you're holding positions of power in government under a constitutional republic that they were creating, that you had to first stop and remember that no one is above the law, not even the judge, not even the prosecutor, not even the policeman. How do we know that our framers had that perspective? Well, look what they wrote in the American Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with a capital C, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life and liberty. They understood the laws of nature and nature's God, and that God naturally puts the law on our heart. They also understood, as I mentioned before, the biblical truth that all have sinned and fallen short. As Lord Acton said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. They said, we're not going to put all the power of government in one place. We're not going to put it in a king or a president. We're not going to put it in a parliament or a legislature. We're not going to put it in the judiciary. We're going to separate power. And to be sure, our founders of our great nation, the framers of our Constitution, they read Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu and Locke and got some notions of separation of power from there. But they also read Isaiah 33:22, which said, the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. It is He who will save us. Again, our framers were not building a theocracy, but they were informed by ancient sacred tenets that gave them a perspective that understood that there was right and wrong and good and bad in the world, and just and unjust, and that you had to ground your constitutional governance and your laws and all your government action with a moral and a foundational basis. When it came to structuring our nation, when it came to putting the structure of our Constitution together, what our framers did is that they divided power. They didn't put it all in one place. They said, well, let's take a moment and ask ourselves, what should a good Constitution do? Well, the very first thing that a good Constitution should do is to provide structure of the government. And again, because all have sinned and fallen short, because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, that structure, we divided the power between a legislator, an executive, and a judiciary. And then beyond that, we took the federal power and said, we're going to give some federal powers to the U.S. Congress. We're going to give some federal powers to the president and the executive branch. And we're going to have the judiciary resolve cases and controversies arising under the Constitution. But if there was more power that was not expressly delegated and expressly listed and given to one of those three branches, all the rest of the power was reserved to the people or to the states. And so we had separation of power, not just between the different branches of government, where you separated power that way, but we also separated power between the federal government and the various state governments. Now, each state was free to, in a sovereign state way, set up its own government. And so they did. And so today we see places like Nebraska that has a unicameral legislature. And we see places like Michigan that have a bicameral legislature. We see the state of Texas that has a judiciary that has two Supreme Courts, one for criminal cases and one for civil cases. We see the High Court of the state of New York called the Court of Appeals, and the lowest court in the state of New York called the Supreme Court. And so each state, they call things differently and they structure it differently, but the idea was that all the remaining power that we, the people, did not give to the federal government, the states would then exercise that power through their own constitutional republics, and they would set it up in a way that they thought best. So things a good constitution should do: provide structure of the government, and that involved separating power. But the second thing that our framers realized, that separating power was not going to be enough. That was going to help preserve liberty. That was going to help deal with the problem that all have sinned and fallen short, and that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But it was not enough. And they knew it was not enough because they came from very oppressive places from around the world on the other side of the ocean that had, spent many great efforts to persecute human beings based on their religious conscience, based on their expression, based on their religious beliefs and where they came from. And so what the framers of the American Constitution said is, we need to do more than separate power. We need to limit the power of government to protect individual rights. And they said, what is the most important rights and freedoms that we need to protect? Let's put that first. Well, so in the very First Amendment, we see things like the free exercise of religious conscience and freedom of speech, and the right to petition government for the redress of grievances, the right to freedom of the press, and things like that. Further down the road in the Bill of Rights, we see the right to due process, and we see in the Second Amendment the right to bear arms and to protect ourselves and our families. So, first thing a good constitution to do, provide the structure of government separating power. Second thing a good constitution should do is to limit the power of government to interfere with fundamental and inalienable rights of the citizens. And the third thing that a good constitution should do, our framers said, was to provide for an amending process. The framers of our Constitution were dealing with the horrendous atrocity of slavery, and from day one you had some of the framers of our Constitution that fought their whole lives to prevent slavery and to stop slavery and to remove it from our nation. The nation could not have happened, though, without the compromise that allowed for slavery at first, but those that had the vision of right and wrong and the perspective that there was good and bad and that there was evil in the world and that evil was slavery, they understood that the way to end that evil was to provide for an amending process. And so the third thing that a good constitution should do is to provide for an amending process. And this our framers did in our Constitution. Now, there's always going to be tension between the government holding power for our benefit, to preserve our liberties, to protect us from invasion, to protect us from conquest of enemies from around the world, and that desire that we want to therefore give, and from we the people, delegate power to the government. But there's going to be tension between that power that the government has and how much we should limit the exercise of that power to preserve our individual liberty. Do we want to have security in the community? Yes, we do. Do we also want to have individual liberty and freedom from government power interfering with our inalienable rights like freedom of speech and free exercise of religious conscience? Absolutely. Now, those two things are always going to be in tension with each other. And so our founders understood that, and so therefore they structured the government in such a way that if those holding power were using a lens of truth and using a lens that all their actions and that all their laws and all that their constitutional actions had to be grounded in a moral and ethical foundation, well, at that point, you start to release the tension, and the tension is gone. Because if your leaders are saying it's not all about me and what I want to force you to do, but it's about right and wrong, just and unjust, and good and evil, then the founders will be exercising their power in such a way that provides for security, but also recognizes that they are limited and can't go as far in exercising that power of the sword, that military power, to interfere with our free exercise of our religious conscience. And so our desire for safety and order in society is met. At the same time, our freedom to express ourselves and to share the good news of Jesus is preserved. What are the functions of a constitution? Well, we've talked about how it structures the government, and by structuring the government, it grants government power. It creates a federal system that grants specific enumerated powers to the federal government, and it tells the government what the structure shall look like. And as we've talked about, it divides power between the federal government, which has separate branches of government, and any remaining power that we did not specifically give to the federal government, it then is reserved to we the people and the states under the 9th and 10th Amendment. And so when you look at the functions of the Constitution, the second thing that we always want to remember is that beyond giving government power, delegating from we the people to the government certain powers to maintain order and preserve our security, it also provides limits to those government authorities in the exercise of that power in order to preserve our individual liberty. And if you haven't figured it out already, our framers of our Constitution and the founders of our nation were nothing less than geniuses. For the first time in human history, it wasn't government by who has the biggest weapon. It was government by the people and for the people. Understanding that all have sinned again and fallen short, they knew that there would be a need for an amending process, especially with the atrocities of human slavery that was in the original document. And so our founders put into that Constitution an amending process. Let's look at the constitutional structure. And we're going to be going in depth into each one of these in later episodes. But for now, let's just do a quick overview of the constitutional structure. What was the role of the legislature? Well, if you go to Article 1 of the United States Constitution, you're going to find the role of the legislative branch. The role of the legislative branch is to make law. And we will go through the specific powers in a second that the legislature has, because we, the people, have delegated it to the legislature in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. The role of the executive branch you find in Article 2. In Article 2, it talks about what the president, what the executive branch can do, and it gives very specific powers that we'll talk about. And then you get to the role of the judiciary, and you find that in Article 3 of the United States Constitution, and you see that we, the people, really didn't give the judiciary, especially the federal judiciary, much power at all, other than the power to decide cases arising under the Constitution and laws of the United States, resolving disputes between the branches, certainly not the power to make law or the power to execute the law. That's delegated to both first the legislature and then second to the executive. Let's look at the constitutional powers that we, the people, have granted to the legislature. It's really important how we do it as well, because our framers of our American Constitution were very explicit when they were talking about the legislative powers. They said legislative powers herein granted. Herein granted, our framers wrote. They were very specific in making sure that the Congress of the United States would understand that their power is very limited. Limited to those powers herein granted. What were some of those powers that were herein granted? Well, the speech and debate clause. That means that we're going to talk about all these things later in the episodes, but that speech and debate clause means that that when you're on the House floor or on the Senate floor, what you are saying, you are immune from any kind of government action. The whole idea was to preserve your freedom as a representative of the people. Then you have the taxing power. Oh man, we figure that out every year around April 15th, don't we? Then we have the spending power, and we see how the government takes our taxes and spends it all over the place. We see the power to declare war, the property power, that is the power to take property for public use. That's going to be a huge one that we'll talk about later. We see the postal power. Why does your mail get delivered? Well, because the Congress has the power of the post. We see power over citizenship. We see the power to regulate commerce among the states. And then we see the impeachment power as those powers that the framers listed as the very limited things that the U.S. Congress could legislate on. Now, let's move to the executive. And again, we're going to spend a lot more time on each one of these later in other episodes. But there's a difference at the very, very beginning in the way that we, the people, delegate power to the legislature than how we delegate power to the executive. When we're delegating power to the executive, unlike that very limited herein granted language we saw in Article 1, in Article 2 it says the executive power is going to be vested in the President of the United States. That is a huge difference, because when you see that we've got now one person that is going to be basically the CEO of the nation, and all executive power is vested in that person, that language suggests that there is some inherent power that is necessary to carry out the execution of the laws and carrying out the governance of the nation. And so in Article 2, we see that all executive power is vested in the president. And then there are some enumerated powers as well. The appointment power, and so, for example, the president has to have a cabinet and officers of the United States to help him run the government. So the appointment clause talks about that power. There's the pardon power. The president has the power to pardons. The president has the veto power. The president has the military power. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the nation. The president has foreign relations power. It is the president that oversees the foreign relations of the nation. The president has the treaty power. And again, some of these powers require, the advice and consent of the Senate or some other branch of government. But the treaty power is given to the president along with the foreign relations power. The president has the power of executive privilege, and we'll talk about that in later episodes as well. What about the constitutional powers granted to the judiciary? The judiciary has what I would call the power of judicial review. They have the power to decide cases and controversies arising under the constitutional laws of the United States. Now, what that does not say is that the judge can change the law. They certainly have the power to determine the constitutionality of acts of the other two branches of government, but to do that, you've got to start with the constitutional provision that is governing the act. You cannot say, well, I don't like that constitutional provision, and I'm going to therefore change it. And so you have the power to say what the law means, but you don't have the power to make up a meaning that you want it to mean. And so we're going to be going through a lot of different things that the government does, whether it's interfering perhaps with our freedom of speech or our free exercise of our religious conscience, or, passes a law regarding abortion. And then you're going to see that these cases sometimes come to the Supreme Court or come into a court. And at that point, it becomes important to remember that the perspective you use matters. Are you starting with a place that there is right and wrong, good and bad, that there's truth truth in the Constitution? Or are you saying that, well, I don't have to follow what I don't like, I can just make it up as I go along? And we're going to see throughout the history of the United States that there has been judges who follow the Constitution, who follow the law, and then apply the law to resolve the case and controversy in front of them. And we're going to find that there are judges that don't like the law, and so they use the opportunity of a case or controversy that is in front of them to say, I don't like the law, so I'm going to change the law first, and then I'm going to resolve the case and controversy. Well, judges are appointed for life. And the reason they're appointed for life and that their salaries can't be reduced is so that they can be independent from politics and not have to worry about if they are deciding a case in controversy based on what the law says, that an election 2 weeks away isn't going to result in them being thrown off the bench. They can just decide the cases based on just what the law is. Well, with that independence comes responsibility. And the responsibility is to decide those cases based on what the law is, not based on what you'd prefer it to be. Because if you can decide cases on what you prefer it to be, you don't deserve a lifetime appointment. You're exercising power outside your constitutional authority. And, not only are you exercising power outside of Article 3, you are exercising power in a way that a dictator would be exercising power, simply because you've got a lifetime appointment and your decision on what the law should be doesn't have to face an election if the people don't like what you do, which is the whole reason under Article 1 and Article 2, the people's representatives in our republic are elected. And the president of our nation is elected. And you have accountability from the citizenry with regard to the policies that are enacted. So we're going to be getting deeper into all of those issues a little later as well, but that's a pretty good introduction to it. The limits on the constitutional exercise of power are really kind of really fun to look at, because most people think immediately of the Bill of Rights and the first 10 amendments, and we're going to spend a lot of time there. But our founders also, even before the Bill of Rights were added to the Constitution, put some constitutional limits on government power. They said, for example, that there could be no ex post facto laws. That is a retroactive statute that creates a new crime or increases punishment for a crime after its commission. Can you imagine that? That all of a sudden you're doing something today, it's not against the law, but somebody in government then passes a law tomorrow that says what you did yesterday was a crime and then puts you in prison for it. Well, that's the kind of laws that some of the citizens of the United States had faced before they came over here across the pond, and they understood that we cannot allow government to write an ex post facto law. You cannot have what's called a bill of attainder. A bill of attainder is a legislative act that inflicts punishment without a judicial trial on a designated individual. So all of a sudden, what if the government tomorrow passes a law that said every person with a beard is guilty of a felony? And now all of a sudden, you're going to jail for 10 years because you've got facial hair. Bills of attainder were prohibited right in our Constitution. Ex post facto laws were prohibited right in our Constitution. And those were things that provide guarantees of personal freedom against government action that limit the exercise of government power. Other limits on government power: procedural due process. The government has to use due process if it's going to take away your life, or take away your liberty, or take away your property. Freedom of speech, the free exercise of religious conscience, the freedom to direct the upbringing of your child, especially with regard to education and medical questions. Our founders really kind of got it right and outside the doors in Philadelphia, and they asked Ben Franklin, what kind of government do we have? Do we have a monarchy or a republic? And Ben Franklin said, we have a republic if you can keep it. The reason that we had this genius of constitutional structure that separated power and that further protects our liberty by limiting the exercise of that power is because those who were putting the structure of our government together and placing limits on those government authorities understood that you had to start with a place that there was right and wrong, good and bad, that there was actually truth, and that every law and that every government action had to be grounded in a moral or an ethical standard. Now, where did that American heritage of truth come from? Well, I just want to show you that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, folks. The character and worldview of our founding fathers came from a place like this. Sam Adams said, "In the supposed state of nature, all men are equally bound by the laws of nature, or to speak more properly, the laws of our Creator." That's with a capital C. They were recognizing that God exists. John Quincy Adams said, "The laws of nature and nature's God, of course, presupposes the existence of a God, the moral ruler of the universe and the rule of right and wrong, of just and unjust, binding upon man, preceding all institutions of human society and of government." Alexander Hamilton, quoting Blackstone, said, "The law of nature, which being coeval with the mankind and dictated by God himself, is of course superior in obligation to any other. It is binding over all the globe, in all countries, and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if they are contrary to this." Our framers started with that perspective, that God exists, and that morality and ethics had to be a foundation of every government law, of the American Constitution, and of every government action. Noah Webster said, "The law of nature is a rule of conduct arising out of the natural relations of human beings established by the Creator and existing prior to any positive precept." That's human law, any human law. "These have been established by the Creator and are, with a peculiar velocity of expression, denominated in the Scripture, ordinances of heaven." John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and a founding father, "The natural law was given by the sovereign of the universe to all mankind," referring to God. Rufus King, who signed the American Constitution, "The law established by the Creator, which has existed from the beginning, extends over the whole globe, is everywhere and at all times binding upon mankind. This is the law of God, by which he makes his way known to man and is paramount to all human control." James Wilson also signed the U.S. Constitution and became one of the early U.S. Supreme Court justices. He said that God is the promulgator as well as the author of natural law. Charles Carroll, who signed the Constitution, said, "Without morals, a republic cannot subsist any length of time. They, therefore, who are decrying the Christian religion, whose morality is so sublime and pure, are undermining the solid foundation of morals, the best security for the duration of a free government." They all understood the necessity of a government being founded on principle with standards that we could look to see if a government action is right or wrong, good or bad, just or unjust. Elias Boudin, president of the Continental Congress, said, "Let us not enter on this important business under the idea that we are Christians on whom the eyes of the world are now turned. Let us earnestly call and beseech him for Christ's sake to preside in our council." Daniel Webster said, "The Christian religion, its general principle must ever be regarded among us as the foundation of civil society." James Madison, the fourth U.S. president, said, "Cursed be all that learning that is contrary to the cross of Christ." James Monroe, the 5th U.S. president, said, "When we view the blessings with which our country has been favored, those which we now enjoy and the means with which we possess of handing them down unimpaired to our latest posterity, our attention is irresistibly drawn to the source from whence they flow. Let us then unite in offering our most grateful acknowledgement for these blessings to the divine author of all good," referring to our Lord. Patrick Henry, ratifier of the U.S. Constitution, said it cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists but by Christians, not on religions but on the gospel of Jesus Christ. For this very reason, the peoples of other faiths have been afforded asylum, prosperity, and the freedom of worship here. Let's go back, and as I finish up this first episode, let's look at what that standard we've been talking about is. In the book of John, chapter 14, verse 6, Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Jesus is saying something special here. He's saying that there is a perspective that matters and that he is the perspective. And we also know from Scripture in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, that the time will come when men will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers. And I'm thinking about law professors and professors around this nation, to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. Those words were written so very, very, very long ago, but they are so appropriate for yes, even today. And how do we see that in our government, in our Supreme Court? Let me give you an example from the case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey. That was one of the cases that were upholding the right to abortion. And we're going to talk more about those in a future episode. But just so you can get and understand the perspective that there are some out there that say, no, truth does not matter. I can literally make it up because I've got a robe on. This is what some Supreme Court justices actually said. They said, referring to themselves as sitting Supreme Court justices, our obligation is to define the liberty of all. We get to tell you what your liberty is. You don't have a right to free exercise of religious conscience. You don't have a right to freedom of speech. We're going to tell you what your liberty is. And in that case, they said you've got a liberty to kill an unborn baby. But they go on and they say, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning in the universe, and the mystery of human life. In other words, they're saying it's all about me. It's all about you and your personal autonomy and your identity. It can be all about you. You can be just like God, these justices were saying. Not much different than what the devil said in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1, is it? This morally relative worldview utterly rejects the self-evident truth of our founders and what God says in the Bible. We find the truth where? Colossians chapter 2, verses 2 and 3 says, in Christ are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Let us not be afraid to use him and his word as our perspective. We're not talking about creating a theocracy. We're just saying that if the atheists out there can have a worldview and a belief system that can influence what they think, the rest of the citizens of this nation are also entitled to allow their biblical worldview that is actually truthful to influence what they think. And if we don't do that, you're just going to end up with a bunch of lawyers out there putting into place whatever they feel is just, whatever they feel is right, whatever they, based on their own personal autonomy and their own identity, want to impose on the rest of the citizenry. And we should remember what Scripture says in Luke 11:52, woe to you lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter yourselves, and you hindered those who were entering. There's some huge implications if we allow the world to shift from a place of truth and a perspective that's grounded in a moral and an ethical notion. Any government action, any law has to be grounded in morality and ethics, to a place where, no, there's no such thing as morality and ethics. It's all about who's ever holding power gets to say what's right and wrong. That shift to that latter belief system is very, very dangerous. It's very much like Darwin's idea that you can evolve the law. And let's talk about that for a second. How did we get to this perspective where you can just, make it up? Well, there was a president of Harvard that had read Darwin's Origin of the Species and saw, hey, we got God out of science. Let's see if we can take that same Darwinian principle of evolution and apply it to law and governance. And he hired a law school dean to do just that. And so that's actually what they did. And they created this new legal philosophical approach to the law and governance that's not based on truth, and it's not based on any ethical or moral standard, but based on who's ever holding power gets to evolve what they want and prefer that public policy to be. And so let me tell you what happens when you allow a perspective like that to become the predominant force in our American judiciary. All of a sudden, conduct evolves into liberty or license. And so let me tell you what I mean by that. Government has always had the power to regulate unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct. And so that's one of the proper functions of government. And we saw that in the way that we've structured our Constitution, and we give the power to government to maintain order, to preserve our security. And so part of that maintaining order and preserving our security is that government can regulate and prosecute unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct. That's why it's against the law to murder somebody. It's against the law to rob a bank. Well, what the folks that have said we get to make it up as we go along have done is they have taken that word conduct and they say, you know what, if government can regulate conduct, but they can't regulate liberty because liberty is a limit on the exercise of government power. And liberty stops government from interfering with our inalienable fundamental rights. Let's call conduct liberty. And so that's exactly what they did. Let's just talk about the killing of an unborn child, which is unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct. And the governments of all the states, almost all the states had made that against the law, and it was against the law to engage in that unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct of killing an unborn child. And what they did is they got a bunch of lawyers together and they went in front of a court and they said, let's take that unhealthy and dangerous and immoral conduct and let's call it liberty, so that instead of government being able to stop it from happening, we will prevent government from interfering with somebody who wants to, a doctor, for example, that wants to kill an unborn child. Not making it up. It's exactly how it happened. And we'll talk more specifically on how it happened when we get to that section, talk about abortion and the sanctity of human life. Likewise for same-sex marriage and science denying access to public school showers and bathrooms. Before, if there was somebody exposing themselves in a woman's locker room, that used to be unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct that got prosecuted. Now folks are arguing that that is liberty and that is freedom and that the government must not interfere with that. Same with infanticide. Infanticide used to be considered unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral, atrocious conduct. Now, in places like the Michigan Constitution, it's being characterized as liberty, and you have a liberty right to even have a baby be killed after it's born. Freedom of speech. Oh, the flip side. That's what they did. If you can take conduct and recharacterize it as liberty to stop government from interfering with the bad things you want to do, well, what if you don't like some of the liberties, like you don't like religious people, for example, and you don't like what some people say? Well, then let's take that liberty. What they do is they take that liberty and they evolve it into conduct, and they call the liberty conduct. And so now all of a sudden your freedom of speech becomes hate speech. And now all of a sudden your free exercise of religious conscience or your religious speech becomes your professional misconduct. If you say the wrong words, they're going to call it conduct, and then they're going to take away your license or they're going to prosecute you. Is that really happening? It's happening literally every day in every state in this nation right now. And that's why it's so important that before we get into the details of the Constitution and even the details of a worldview behind judicial interpretation, that we start with the very basics, that we start with the perspective through which we will choose to see the world. Choose your beliefs well, folks, because you will live by them or you will die by them. I think it's really important that we understand that we, the people, have a great opportunity here to preserve and, if necessary, help to restore the constitutional order in this nation. Our framers were brilliant. They understood that there would be times that the exercise of government power and our freedoms that we so cherish under our Constitution would be in tension with each other. But they designed a constitutional form of government with citizens' participation that would prevent tyranny of the majority, that would prevent tyranny of a small minority. The only question is, will we as citizens know enough about our Constitution, know enough about how it's supposed to work, that through participating in our constitutional governance, we can ensure that the next generation can have those same liberties, and that we can share the good news of Jesus, for example, while being in a place where we can trust and know that our nation will be out there protecting, our government will be protecting those liberties and ensuring the security of the nation. Until next time, this is Professor William Wagner for Keepers of Liberty.